My husband filed for divorce on the morning of our 10th anniversary. He filed first. He smiled doing it. He thought year 10 made him safe, that the timing was his finish line. I had known for 3 weeks. I let him file anyway. I watched him smile. He stopped being clean 6 years ago. I stayed clean the entire time, not because I was waiting for this, because I believed the agreement meant something. I was the only one in that marriage who did. While I believed in the contract, he was building his exit inside it. 6 years of paperwork I was never supposed to find, filed in structures I was never supposed to read, while I was still in the building. So I let the documents speak. Call it patience, call it strategy. I spent 10 years asking myself if there's a difference. Stay long enough and you will too. His lawyer arrived at 8:47 a.m. I know the time because I checked. Not then, I checked after because I wanted to know exactly how long it took him to start the clock on the day he'd been building toward for 10 years. Crispin was already in the entry hall when I came downstairs. That was the first thing. He didn't send the lawyer alone. He was there, in his charcoal suit, the double-breasted one he wore to closings, standing beside a man I recognized from our corporate structure, and the expression on his face was the one he used when he believed a room already belonged to him.
My husband filed for divorce on the morning
The
of our 10th
lawyer
anniversary.
set a cream envelope
He
on the
filed
entry
first.
table.
He smiled doing
the
it.
kind of document
He thought
that has
year
weight
10 made
because
him
the people
safe,
who
that
assembled
the
it wanted
timing
you
was
to
his
feel
finish
it.
line. I
I
known
walked
for
to the
3
table,
weeks.
and I picked
let
it
him
up
file
myself.
anyway.
I didn't
I
wait for
watched
someone
him
to hand it
smile.
to me.
He
I
stopped
decided
being
that was going
clean
to be
6
my
years
choice
ago.
at least.
I
How the
stayed clean the
transaction
entire
happened in
time,
my own
not
house.
because I was waiting for
Zareen,
this, because
that's
I
all he
believed
said.
the agreement
My
meant
name,
something.
the way you
I
say
was
a
the only
name when
one
you
in that
think you're
marriage
being
who
gracious.
did. While I
opened
believed in
the
the
envelope,
contract,
read
he was
the first
building his
page.
exit
He
inside
was
it.
waiting for
6
something,
years of
a
paperwork
question,
I
a
was never
flinch,
supposed
a
to
negotiation
find,
that would
filed
tell
in
him I hadn't
structures I was
seen this
never
coming.
supposed to read.
He waited
while I
long
was
enough
still
that
in
the
the building.
silence became its
So
own
I let
answer.
the document speak.
Here's what I
Call
knew
it
that
patience,
he didn't.
call it
The
strategy.
prenup only
I
held
spent 10
if his
years asking
disclosures stayed
myself if
clean
there's a
throughout the
difference.
marriage.
Stay long
They
enough
hadn't,
and you will
not
too.
for 6 years. I didn't say that. I set the first page down, picked up the second, and kept reading. He signed the prenup 10 years ago, believing it was a timer, wait out the maturity clause, file at the right moment, walk away with the structure intact. What he forgot, or chose to forget, is that the timer only runs in your favor if you've been honest about everything you own, every transfer, every entity, every name inside every structure. He adjusted his cufflinks. I noticed that. Took me a long time to learn that's what he does when he's recalibrating. Not nervous, not guilty, just quietly updating the plan. 10 years of watching that gesture, and I finally understood it. I handed the filing back to his lawyer, not to him, and said I'd have my attorney review it by end of day. He nodded, said something about hoping this could stay civil, left the entry hall the same way he arrived, unhurried, like the outcome was already settled. The entry hall was quiet. I stood there for a moment with the envelope in my hands, the filing, the prenuptial agreement he thought had finally expired into his favor, and 10 years of a marriage that had just been handed to me in cream bond paper. I wasn't afraid of the filing. I'd been expecting it for 3 weeks. What I wasn't expecting, what I'm still not entirely sure I've finished understanding, is how ordinary he looked doing it, how scheduled.
I went to my office, not his, mine. The adjacent wing, smaller, which he always found telling. I found it practical. The room was organized the way I keep everything, by date, by entity, by risk. The desk surface had 3 items on it: my phone, a pen, and a manila file folder I had placed there 11 days earlier when I finished confirming what I'd suspected 3 weeks before that. Let me explain something, because this is the part people find difficult to believe. I didn't open that file because I knew he was going to file for divorce. I opened it because of a number. 14 months ago, during a routine quarterly review of our joint portfolio, I found a discrepancy. Small, the kind of number that looks like a rounding error if you're not paying attention, and I am always paying attention. An entity in the hospitality structure showing a transfer allocation that didn't match its disclosed subsidiary schedule, off by a fraction of a percent. Most people would have called it an administrative error. I pulled the thread. 3 weeks of pulling that thread led to 6 years of transfers I had never been told about. Not because I wasn't entitled to know, because someone had decided the cleanest way to manage the structure was to keep the disclosures narrow. He didn't file because I found out. He filed because year 10 arrived on the calendar. Those are two separate decisions, and the fact that they landed on the same morning, that was his miscalculation, not mine. I opened the file. Transfer records going back 6 years, entity registrations for 3 sister-managed holding companies, ownership structures I hadn't seen on any of the joint disclosures I'd reviewed and signed. 6 years of documents that had been filed in a separate architecture from everything he'd told me we owned together. I remember sitting there for a moment, looking at the top page, not at the numbers, at the dates. The first transfer was dated 4 months into year 4 of our marriage. That's when it started. Year 4, the year we expanded into the Pacific portfolio and he said we were building something that would outlast us both. I picked up my phone and called Nima Delvaux, my attorney, the one who wrote the clause. She answered on the second ring. He filed, I said. 1 beat of silence, then we're ready. That was it. No strategy session, no panic. She'd reviewed the materials I'd sent her 10 days earlier. She knew what we had. The call was confirmation, not conversation. I sat with that for a moment. The file open on my desk, the filing still in my bag from the entry hall, Nima's 2 words settling in the room. I've been asked since whether I felt anything in that moment. Satisfaction, grief, vindication, any of it. Honestly, I felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been holding something heavy for 3 weeks and is finally standing close enough to the table to put it down. Nima Delvaux arrived at 11:10. She has been my attorney for 12 years. She drafted the Prenup's compliance provision before the ink was dry on the marriage license. And she is the kind of lawyer who arrives to a meeting having already finished the argument she intends to make. She sat across from me at the desk, set her leather document case flat on the surface beside the open file, and looked at the materials without touching them for a full 30 seconds. Then she said, "Walk me through what you found first, in your own sequence." That's something I've always respected about Nima. She doesn't read your work and then tell you how she would have done it. She reads your work and then asks why you made the choices you made. In 11 years of working with lawyers, she's the only one who ever treated the way I think as a resource rather than an obstacle. So I walked her through it. The discrepancy started in the Pacific portfolio, a transfer allocation that didn't match the disclosed subsidiary schedule by a fraction of a percent. Most people would have called it a rounding error. I pulled the thread because I pull all threads. That's not strategy, that's just how I read documents. The thread led to the first holding company, sister managed, registered under a family entity in Crispin's sister's name, which kept it 1 degree removed from joint disclosure requirements. The second and third companies used similar structures, all 3 created within a 14-month window starting in year 4 of our marriage. Nima was making notes, not on my pages, in her own notebook. She has a practice of keeping parallel records. I've always found it reassuring. 6 years of transfers, I said. None of them appeared on any joint disclosure I reviewed and countersigned. She nodded without looking up. And the disclosures you signed, were they presented as complete at the time? Every one. Here's what I understood, sitting in that room with the document spread between us, that I don't think Crispin ever understood about the structure he built.
It was legible, not immediately, not to someone skimming a quarterly summary, but to someone who reads every page and notes every number that doesn't reconcile with the previous quarter's baseline. It was always going to be legible. He built something he believed was invisible. What he actually built was something that required me not to look. He'd been counting on the version of Zareen who finds a discrepancy and writes it off as an error. That version doesn't exist. That version doesn't exist. I turned to the third page in the holding company file, transfer records for the second entity, the smaller of the three, the one with the most recent filings, and there in the beneficiary designation section was a name I didn't recognize, a woman, designated as a structural beneficiary inside a concealed entity 4 years prior. I read the line, set the page down. Nima watched me set it down. She didn't need to. The designation was what it was, a name inside a structure that was never disclosed to me, filed by my husband while we were still married, while I was still signing disclosures that didn't mention any of this. It wasn't an emotional moment. I want to be precise about that. I didn't feel rage or grief or the particular humiliation people expect from a wife who finds evidence of something like this. What I felt was the specific clarity of a woman looking at documentation that confirms a hypothesis she'd already formed. She existed in his paperwork. That's all I needed to know for now. I refiled the page. Nima closed her notebook. "The compliance clause," she said. 2 words, the way she'd say them if she were reading a page number, not activating a legal mechanism she designed a decade earlier. "Yes," I said, "let's talk about the compliance clause." Nima left to make calls. I told her I needed an hour before we finalized the arbitration request. What I needed was 10 minutes alone with the prenup. I took it from my bag, the original, the copy I'd kept in the fireproof file in the back of my closet for 10 years. Some things you keep because you're organized. Some things you keep because you know, somewhere below the part of you that wants to believe in a marriage, that you might need them. I turned to the compliance clause, page 41. I know the page number because I checked it when Nima first drafted it, and I checked it every time I recertified our joint disclosures. And I have known for 3 weeks that it says exactly what I needed it to say. I read it aloud, to myself, in the quiet of my office, on the morning my husband filed for divorce. The protective provisions of this agreement apply solely to the party who has maintained continuous, full disclosure of all material asset transfers, entity formations, and beneficial interest designations throughout the duration of the marriage. Failure to disclose shall render the applicable provisions void as applied to the non-compliant party. I'd read that language 100 times. It landed differently this morning. Not because it had changed, because everything around it had. Crispin signed that clause 10 years ago, believing the prenup was a timer. Wait for year 10, file, walk away clean. What he didn't account for was the word continuous. What he didn't account for was that the clause wasn't measuring time. It was measuring honesty. He stopped being honest in year 4. I closed the prenup, set it on the desk, and for the first time since the envelope arrived this morning, I felt the full weight of what was about to happen. Not to me, to him. To the strategy he'd spent 6 years assembling inside structures he believed I would never find. I chose in that moment not to call him, not to warn him, not to give him the chance to amend the disclosures or restructure the entities or find some procedural exit from what the clause was going to do. I chose to let the document speak. I'd been waiting 10 years for it to have something worth saying. The private arbitration suite was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that rents its rooms by the hour and keeps no records of what gets decided in them. Neutral ground, in theory, which is another way of saying it belongs to whoever arrives most certain they've already won. Crispin arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled start. I know this because the building's front desk noted his arrival time in the visitor log, and I reviewed that log afterward. He brought his lead counsel, a man named Hargrove, who I recognized from 3 of our corporate closings, and a second attorney I didn't know, seated to take notes. They arranged themselves on the left side of the long table, Crispin at center, both lawyers flanking him. He set his glass of water precisely at his right hand, the same way he sets everything. One placement, no adjustment, settled. Nima and I arrived at the scheduled time, not early. There's a version of this story where I walk into that room 20 minutes early and stake my position at the table. That's not the version I lived. I let him have the room. He'd been imagining owning it for years. I figured he could have the first 20 minutes. We sat across from them. Nima set her document case flat on the table, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at Hargrove with an expression I've seen her use exactly once before, when a counterparty once brought a contract to a closing that didn't match the version they'd negotiated. Contained, completely unimpressed. Hargrove opened. He was good, I'll say that. He spoke about the prenuptial agreement the way architects describe buildings, as something designed for a purpose, executed with precision, ready to perform the function it was built for. The 10-year maturity clause, he said, represented a negotiated exit mechanism that both parties had agreed to. The marriage had reached its term. The agreement's protective provisions were now fully operative. He said the phrase fully operative twice. Lawyers who say the same phrase twice usually believe the phrase is doing more work than it is. Crispin said almost nothing during Hargrove's opening. He didn't need to. He let the argument move through the room, watched it land. He already knew how it ended. He probably helped draft it. His water glass stayed where he placed it. He didn't touch it once. I sat across from him and I thought, he has been planning the language of this opening for years, maybe since year 6, maybe before that. And then I thought, the language doesn't matter. The compliance record does. I said nothing. Nima said nothing. We let Hargrove finish. When Hargrove stopped speaking, the arbitrator, a woman named Creston, who had reviewed both parties' pre-submissions and whose expression had given nothing away since the moment we sat down, looked at our side of the table and asked if we were prepared to begin our response. Nima said yes. She opened her document case. Nima opened the case and placed a bound document set on the table in front of the arbitrator. A second set went to Hargrove. Clean copies, tabbed. The kind of preparation that communicates, before anyone reads a page, that the person who assembled it has read every page themselves. Forensic discovery materials, Nima said. 6 years of undisclosed asset transfers from the marital estate into 3 holding companies incorporated under a family entity and not reflected on any joint disclosure countersigned by my client during the marriage. She said it the way she says everything important, at the same volume as everything else. Hargrove objected immediately. Relevance, procedural grounds. The prenup's maturity clause, he said, was the operative framework, and materials relating to asset management were outside the scope of the arbitration's designated review. The arbitrator, Creston, looked at the bound set for a moment. Then she looked at Nima. "Counsel, I'll need your relevance argument." Nima had it in one sentence. The prenup's protective provisions apply only to the party who maintained continuous full disclosure of all material asset transfers. These materials are the disclosure record. They are the scope. Creston allowed the materials. I watched Hargrove absorb that ruling and turned to Crispin. Low voice, one sentence. I couldn't hear it from across the table. Whatever it was, Crispin's response was to pick up the bound set and begin reading the first page. That was the first thing that changed. Not dramatically. He didn't put the document down or push back from the table. He picked it up and began reading, and the water glass he'd placed at his right hand at the start of the session sat exactly where he'd left it, and he didn't reach for it once. I've watched Crispin in rooms his entire adult professional life. When he's certain he doesn't read the materials other people put in front of him, he waits for his counsel to summarize.
The fact that he picked up the bound set himself and started reading it, that was the tell. His counsel was still speaking. He read through the transfer summary on page 1, turned to page 2, the dates on the holding company registrations, year 4 of our marriage, 14 months into the Pacific portfolio expansion, the same window he told me we were building something that would outlast both of us. I didn't watch him read it for long. I didn't need to. I'd read it myself 100 times. I knew every date on every page. What I hadn't prepared for, and I want to be honest about this, was how small he made him look, not morally, physically. The man who had arranged the room at his advantage, who let his counsel speak for 15 minutes about operative clauses and negotiated frameworks, was now reading a page of transfer records with the focused attention of someone doing arithmetic they don't like the results of. Hargrove was still speaking, something about the timeline of the discovery and the admissibility of materials not disclosed in the pre-submission. The arbitrator was taking notes. I noticed that Crispin had stopped listening to Hargrove. I filed that away.
Nima let them finish with the holding company transfer records before she turned to the second section of the discovery materials. The arbitrator had moved into a period of review, reading through the entity registrations, the transfer dates, the disclosure summary that laid out what had been filed when and against what countersigned statements from the joint estate. Hargrove was making notes. Crispin had set the bound document down and was watching Creston read. Then Nima said, "There is a secondary element of the discovery materials I'd like to direct the arbitrator's attention to." She placed a single page in front of Creston. A copy went to Hargrove. "A beneficiary designation," Nima said, "filed within one of the 3 concealed holding entities 4 years prior to today's arbitration. The designated party is not a named member of the marital estate, not a disclosed business partner, and does not appear on any joint document countersigned by my client during the course of the marriage." She didn't say anything else. The page said it. Hargrove picked it up, read it, set it down, turned to Crispin. What happened in that moment, I've thought about it since, tried to find the right word for it. It wasn't panic. It wasn't guilt. It was the specific stillness of a man who has just confirmed something he had been hoping, at some level, would never become legible. His hands went flat on the table, both of them, flat, still, the way you press your palms down when you're steadying yourself without wanting anyone to see that you need steadying. I recognized the gesture. I'd watched him use it once before, in a deal closing that went wrong at the last hour, when the other party found a clause his team had missed. He didn't argue. He went still. He started recalculating. I want to be precise about what I felt watching that, because this is the part people expect to be triumphant, and it wasn't. It was quieter than that. He had built something, years of it, layers of it, a structure sophisticated enough that it took a forensic accountant 3 weeks to trace it back to the source. That's not nothing. Whatever I think of the decision to build it, the architecture itself was careful. And now it was sitting on a table in a rented room being read by an arbitrator who had no reason to rule in his favor. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the specific weight of watching something someone built become the thing that undoes them. Hargrove spoke quietly to Crispin. Then he addressed the arbitrator. He requested a 15-minute recess. His voice was measured. He's good enough to keep it measured, but the request itself said everything. Creston granted it. The corridor outside the arbitration suite was narrow and overlit. Fluorescent ceiling panels, a row of chairs against the wall that no one was sitting in, a window at the far end showing a gray afternoon sky over Midtown. Nima stood with her document case. I stood at the window. She spoke first. The compliance argument is clean. The transfer records support the breach. The beneficiary designation supports the intent. She paused. When we go back in, I read the clause. I nodded. I already knew that. We'd been building toward that sentence for 3 weeks. There was a beat of quiet between us,
The kind of quiet that happens when both people in a conversation have said everything they need to say about one subject and neither of them has moved to the next one. I asked her the question I'd been carrying since the morning the filing arrived. If he had disclosed everything, if he had stayed clean the whole time, would the prenup have been fair? Nima didn't answer immediately. She set the document case on one of the corridor chairs and thought about it, which is something she does. She actually thinks before she answers questions that deserve thinking. I've always respected that about her. Probably, she said. For him. 3 words. I've been sitting with them since. She wasn't being unkind. She was being precise. The prenup, the one she drafted, the one I'd signed, the one I'd read every clause of before putting my name on it, was designed to give Crispin a structured exit if the marriage ended at the 10-year mark. That's what the maturity clause did. He negotiated it. He believed it was reasonable. He might have been right about that. The compliance clause was Nima's addition. My addition, technically. I was the one who asked for a disclosure requirement. Not because I suspected he would hide assets, because I'm the kind of person who reads contracts and notices when there are no consequences for dishonesty. I asked for a consequence. And now I was standing in a corridor waiting to use it. Standing at that window, I asked myself something I still haven't answered. Was I using it because he broke the rule, or was I using it because he broke the rule in a way that made the year 10 exit work in his favor and I needed it not to? Those aren't the same thing, and I couldn't separate them cleanly. What I knew, standing at that window in the overlit corridor, is this. The prenup was never just a timer. He signed it believing the 10-year date was the finish line, that arriving at year 10 meant he'd won. What the compliance clause built into that timer was a condition, not loyalty, not fidelity, disclosure. One requirement, tell the truth about what you own and who benefits from it, every year, continuously. He stopped doing that in year 4. The 10-year date didn't protect him. It just made the gap between what he disclosed and what he actually built exactly large enough to count. Inside the suite, I learned later from Hargrove's notes, which entered the record during the remedy phase, that Crispin had spent 11 of the 15 recess minutes reading the compliance clause, the specific provision on page 41 of the prenup he'd signed a decade earlier and never opened again. His hands were flat on the table. His counsel was speaking. He wasn't listening. Nima picked up her document case. I turned from the window. We went back in. We sat back down at the table. Hargrove said something to the arbitrator about the materials needing further review time, a procedural argument that was really a request for a delay he wasn't going to get. Creston declined. The session would continue. Nima opened the prenup to page 41. She placed it flat on the table in front of the arbitrator. She read the compliance clause aloud, the same language I had read to myself in my private office that morning, the same words I had memorized on page 41 a decade ago and checked against every joint disclosure I'd signed since. The same clause that had been sitting, patient, in a document both parties agreed to, waiting for the exact set of facts that 6 years of hidden paperwork eventually produced. Nima read it at the same pace she reads everything. No emphasis, no performance. The language did its own work. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Crispin's hands were still flat on the table. When Nima finished reading, the room went quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, not the kind of silence that waits to be filled, the kind that arrives when everyone present understands that the next thing said will be official and no one is in a hurry to make it so. Creston, the arbitrator, set the prenup flat on the table and read the compliance clause again, to herself this time. Then she placed it beside the transfer summary from the forensic discovery materials, then beside the beneficiary designation. 3 documents in a row. She read across all 3 without speaking. I watched Crispin during those 2 minutes.
He had arrived at that table certain. I'd seen that version of him hundreds of times, the posture that reads as relaxed, but is really just a man who has decided the outcome in advance and is waiting for the room to catch up, in a closing, in a board session, in a dinner with someone he needed something from. The physical ease of a person who hasn't been wrong in a room in a very long time. The certainty left first. Not all at once, a degree at a time, the way a room loses heat. You don't notice the exact moment it happened, only that it has. His right hand, which had been resting loose on the table, moved to the arm of his chair, his jaw set. He glanced at Hargrove, who was reading the compliance clause on his own copy, and Hargrove did not look up. That's when Crispin understood the room had changed. Not when Creston spoke, not when the ruling landed, the moment Hargrove didn't look up. I have spent 10 years watching Crispin read rooms. The thing I understood sitting across from him in that neutral-lit suite is that the same skill that made him effective, the ability to read a room before it spoke, was the thing that delivered the ruling to him before Creston announced it. He knew. Before the words, he knew. His water glass sat exactly where he'd placed it at the start of the session. He hadn't touched it once. In 11 years of watching him manage difficult rooms, I'd never seen him leave a glass untouched. That was the detail that told me the composure performance had already ended. Creston set down her pen. She looked across the table.
Creston spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. It's in the session transcript. I read it 3 times. 4 minutes and 30 seconds to confirm what the documents had taken 6 years to produce and 3 weeks to assemble. She confirmed the compliance clause had been triggered, the prenup's protective framework, the maturity provision, the settlement terms Hargrove had argued for 40 minutes, was void as applied to Crispin's assets. Void. Not suspended, not reduced. Void. The appreciation equity would transfer. 10 years of growth inside the joint empire, the hospitality portfolio, the Pacific properties, the domestic acquisitions, would be calculated and attributed under the agreement's breach provision. The numbers would take weeks to finalize. The principal transferred in that room in those 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The proxy voting rights shifted temporarily to me, pending legal resolution of the holding company structures. Pending resolution meaning until the 3 sister-managed entities were unwound and their assets properly disclosed, the governance votes inside the empire would sit in my hands. The votes had moved. He had lost the room. Hargrove asked for an adjournment to review remedies. His voice was measured. He kept it measured, I'll say that for him. Creston granted the adjournment. It was a procedural courtesy. The ruling had already landed. Crispin stood. He picked up his phone from the table. He straightened his jacket, both hands, lapels, the quick double press of a man who has done this gesture 10,000 times in rooms where things went wrong. Then he picked up his leather portfolio and walked to the door. He did not look at me. I watched him reach the door. I watched his hand on the handle, and I thought about the version of this morning where he had arrived at this table 20 minutes early and arranged the room to his advantage, and how the room had looked then. His water glass at his right hand, his counsel flanking him, a man who hadn't moved his water glass since he placed it. And I thought, he left the glass. It was still there, full, on his side of the table. He'd walked out and left it exactly where he'd placed it. I don't know why that detail stayed with me. It still does. The room emptied in stages. Hargrove and his associate first, papers gathered, portfolio closed, a brief, low exchange with Crispin's associate in the corridor that I wasn't meant to hear and didn't try to. Then Creston, who collected the session materials with the efficiency of someone whose next appointment was already scheduled. She thanked both parties, which I appreciated for its precision, thanking people for participating in a process that existed to determine who had been dishonest was exactly the right level of formality. Nima turned to me before she left. She said, "The remedy calculation will take 3 to 4 weeks. The proxy rights notice goes out tomorrow morning. Then she said, "You did this correctly." She picked up her document case and stepped into the corridor to make a call. 3 sentences. That's Nima's version of a celebration. I sat at the table. The prenup was still there, open, page 41 visible, the compliance clause annotated in Crispin's handwriting with the breach findings. Crispin's signature was on the cover page, still readable through the angle of the document. Both our signatures, actually. Mine was on the second line. I'd signed it the same day he did, in this same city, 10 years ago, in a conference room not entirely unlike this one. I looked at that document for a long time. I didn't touch it. It belonged to the record now. It wasn't mine to carry. Here is the thing I've been trying to find the right way to say. I stayed compliant for 10 years, every disclosure, every counter-signature, every quarterly review, not because I was building toward this, not because I was waiting for the moment the clause would turn against him. I stayed compliant because the agreement said to, because I was the kind of person who reads contracts and then honors them, regardless of whether the other party is doing the same. That's the distinction that matters to me, that I was honest because the agreement asked me to be, not because I was positioning myself. I am not entirely sure anyone else will see the difference. What I know is this. Nima designed a clause that required continuous honesty from both parties. He signed it. He stopped being honest in year 4. The clause did exactly what it was designed to do when the right set of facts finally existed. I didn't outmaneuver him. I just didn't stop reading. That's the whole story. The B-plot, the fine print, the habit he found excessive, none of it was strategy. It was just who I was inside the marriage, the same person I was outside it, the only person in that agreement who stayed the same throughout. The question I sat with in that empty room, the one I am still sitting with, is not whether I was right. The arbitrator answered that. The question is whether being right about a contract is the same as understanding what the contract cost. 10 years. I was 38 years old. The empire was partially mine in ways it hadn't been that morning. The room was empty, and I was still fully dressed for it. Charcoal jacket, ivory blouse, the thin gold chain I'd put on that morning without thinking, the same way I'd dressed every morning of those 10 years. I picked up my bag. I did not take the prenup. I walked to the door of the arbitration suite. At the frame, I stopped. One breath, hand on the wood. Not for drama, because I needed a second to understand that the next step was no longer inside the story I'd been living. It was somewhere after it. I stepped through. Day 2 arrived the way the morning after any reckoning does, quietly, without asking if you were ready. I was in my office by 7. Different clothes. I'd left the charcoal suit on the chair in my bedroom and chosen something simpler, a dark wool jacket over a white shirt, as if the armor grade needed to come down one level now that the room requiring the armor was over. Nima sent the formal legal notices at 8:42. I was holding my coffee when her message came through. Sent. To Hargrove's firm, to the holding company administrators, to the empire's governance structure confirming the temporary proxy transfer. 2 sentences. She sends consequential things in 2 sentences. The equity transfer confirmation came at 9, 2 pages, summary of the breach provision, calculation methodology, effective date. I read it standing at my desk, set it down beside my coffee. The equity transfer confirmation was 2 pages. The marriage was 10 years. I remember thinking, he used to negotiate better ratios than that. Nima called at 9:15 to confirm Hargrove had received the notices and that no immediate counterfiling was expected. The paper trail was too clean. She used the phrase, "no viable procedural ground," which is the kind of language that in a different context would feel like victory. In this context, it felt like a door closing so quietly you only heard it afterward.
He wasn't going to fight it. I'd known that before she called. A man who built a structure carefully enough to last 6 years knows when the structure has been read correctly. Contesting the ruling would require arguing that the compliance clause didn't apply to the transfers, and the transfers were in the record, his own record. He built it too carefully to argue it didn't exist. I set the phone down, picked up my coffee, looked at the confirmation notice and the coffee and the organized desk that had held the file for 3 weeks before this morning, and I thought about all the things I'd expected to feel when this notice arrived. I had expected, I don't know, something, a shift in the air, some version of the moment you imagine in advance that never arrives on schedule. What arrived was the flat, specific quiet of a morning after something is finished. I left the building at 11:30. No car waiting. I hadn't arranged one. I don't know if that was oversight or instinct. I just walked. The pavement outside was ordinary. Gray stone, overcast sky, the mid-morning movement of a city that doesn't know and doesn't need to know what just concluded on the 14th floor of a building that rents its rooms by the hour. A man walking a dog, a woman with a takeaway coffee, the indifference of a city that owed her nothing, going about its morning while hers had just ended or begun. You can call it either, depending on which part of the last 2 days you're holding. I walked for a while without thinking about where I was going. Then I thought about the compliance clause. Not what it triggered. I knew what it triggered. That was in the confirmation notice beside my coffee that morning. What I thought about was why it was in the prenup at all, why I'd asked for it. Not strategically, not because I suspected at 28 that by 38 I'd be standing on a pavement in overcast light having just used it. I asked for it because the agreement didn't have a consequence for dishonesty, and I was the kind of person who noticed when agreements didn't have consequences for dishonesty and asked for one. That's all it was, a reading habit, a correction. He built a plan, I built a clause. The marriage was what happened in between. I've been trying to figure out what I won, not legally. Legally, I know what I won. The equity transfer, the proxy rights, the confirmation notice with the 2-page summary. What I mean is what I actually hold walking down this pavement that I didn't hold yesterday morning when the cream envelope was still on the entry table. What I hold is the knowledge that I was who I believed I was inside the marriage, that I read every document, that I signed every disclosure, that when the compliance clause asked me to be honest about everything I owned, I was, because the alternative was being someone I didn't recognize, not because I was protecting a position, because the agreement asked. That's the thing I keep. It's small, and it's not nothing. I looked up at the sky, gray and even the way it gets in this city when it can't decide whether to rain. I was 38 years old. The 10 years were not coming back. The empire was partially mine in new ways that I would spend the next several months understanding and practice. I was alone on a pavement, and the marriage had become paperwork, and I had no one I would call first with any of this. I breathed. I walked. He thought the prenup was a door. I thought it was a promise. It turned out to be a record. 10 years of what we each actually did, waiting to be read by someone with no reason to favor either of us. A document that accumulated every signature, every disclosure, every countersignature, every year of transfers that were made and the years of transfers that weren't. It gathered, quietly, without opinion. And at the end of 10 years, when both of us came into the room with our versions of what the prenup meant, the prenup simply showed us what it had actually been recording. His plan, my clause, the years in between. I left the prenup on the table. I don't know if that was dignity or exhaustion. Some things you stop carrying not because you've decided to, but because you've been carrying them long enough that setting them down is just what your hands do. What I kept, walking out of that building, through the city, in the overcast, ordinary light of a day 2 morning that didn't know my name, was this. I was honest inside the agreement. Not strategically, not tactically, because the agreement asked me to be, and I was the kind of person who honored what an agreement asked. That's the whole story. It's a small thing. It is not nothing. He filed first. He smiled, doing it. The contract hadn't finished reading him yet.
This is American Billionaire Tales, where fortune meets fate. Some agreements survive everything except the people who sign them. If you're sitting with the question of which one of us was right, good. That question is supposed to be uncomfortable. Leave your answer below. I read every one. And if this story stayed with you long enough to reach this moment, stay. There are more rooms like the one on the 14th floor. More documents, more patience, more 10-year plans. Subscribe. I'll be here when the next one opens.